Okay, so good afternoon. For those of you in Mountain Time or East, good morning. For those of you in Pacific Time, thanks for joining us today. I have the perhaps unenviable task of talking about roadmaps, which are another form of logic models or theory of change, right as everybody's either hangry because they haven't had lunch or they have eaten their lunch and now are settling into the afternoon slump. But I promise I'm going to try to make logic models and theory of change as exciting as it can possibly be. And I have brought a couple of reinforcements with me today to help out with that task. So we'll get to them in a second, but I just want to acknowledge that Aaron Olikin from the state of Vermont and Gerard Johnson from the state of Michigan are joining me today. And we'll have a chance to interact with them in just a little bit about their experience using this strategy. If you'd like to in the chat, feel free to say hello and let us all know where you're from, especially for our guests, so that they can kind of get a sense of who's represented on the call. While you're doing that, I'll say just a couple of words about our objectives for today's session. There are three. The first is I want you to walk away from the session feeling like you understand when and how to develop a roadmap for change. I'll also spend a little bit of time defining what that is and why we call it something different than, say, a logic model or a theory of change, which many of you, I'm guessing, are familiar with. Second thing is I want you to walk away understanding the difference between an innovation and the strategies to promote the adoption of an innovation. So spend some time talking about what that means and the distinction between the two. Third, because our colleagues are here from Vermont and Michigan, I want you to learn from them, TANF practitioners that are in shoes similar to yours, how they have used roadmaps for change in their program innovation, and how it's actually been a tool for improvement, not just an academic exercise for a researcher. So with that, let's just see if our friends at OFA want to say any additional words of welcome, or Jeanette, our project director.
Hi, John. This is Lisa Washington Thomas from ACF OFA. I want to thank you for this training that you're about to do. I heard a preview and I'm really excited. I also want to thank Vermont and Aaron for participating. We appreciate you each and every time. And I want to thank all of you for coming. You're in for a treat. John is an excellent trainer and he has information that will be actually useful in your process. And so we thank Aaron and all the other presenters who are going to help us demonstrate how beneficial this roadmap is in making changes. So thank you so much, Jeanette.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, John. No, I just want to say welcome to everybody in the Collective TA group. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you guys for making this happen. All right, so I've got a quick reflection exercise for you. When I say theory of change or logic model, what is the first word that comes to your mind? Pop it in the chat. First word that comes to your mind when I say that. Brittany on the spot. Ain. Dr. Nicole, thank you. Awesome. It's not a trick question. Just whatever came up for you as soon as I said theory of change or logic model. What came up? All right, some good stuff in here. I love it, Sorna. Ugh. Yep, that sounds about right. Okay, so I'm seeing a range here, not all negative, that's good, but certainly not all positive. So with that, regardless of what your experience with theories of change or logic models has been up to this point, and whether you're coming in with sort of a positive or a negative foundation to build on, I hope that you will, for a moment, set aside prior experience with logic models and think about kind of what I have to share and what both Aaron and Gerard will talk about as not exactly the way you've always experienced or thought about those things. Because I want to redefine it not as just an exercise. I want to redefine it as an active and living tool for managing change. And if we can sort of reconceive it as something that we use on a daily basis that actually helps us do the work, it's not just this conceptual exercise, then I think that will also help us think about not just what value it can provide to our teams, but how it can be relevant to the work that you're doing right now under the TLC. So this graphic should look pretty familiar at this point. If not, let your coach know, and we can do a little getting up to speed with you on that. But this is the Learn, Innovate, Improve framework that we're kind of helping guide all of the work that we are doing together. And so today we're going to focus in on the innovate phase. For many of you, we've spent a lot of time in the learn phase, unpacking that motivation for change and the problem to solve, clarifying who our stakeholders are and how we're going to meaningfully engage them, looking closely at our environment and our ecosystem and exploring what's going to help and hinder the change that we have planned. So today, regardless of how close you are to really starting that innovate phase, designing and beginning to implement a solution, I want to lay it out for you and talk about how a roadmap for change can help you make that transition from learning and exploring what it is you're going to do to actually starting to plan it and get ready for implementation in a way that leads with curiosity and learning. So let's talk about the innovate phase. Building on the learn phase, because none of this should be disconnected. It's not like there's just sort of clean break and like, okay, we've checked all those boxes. Now it's on to innovation. Now the fun begins. It is fun, but we want to stay grounded in what we've actually learned and recognize that this is a cyclical process, right? We're coming back around to learn again. So let's make sure that we build on our work in the learn phase here. We want to do three things in the innovate phase. We want to design a solution, however large or small that is, for each of your teams. Design a solution that draws on existing evidence and experience, right? We don't want to just develop something in a vacuum. We want to be connected to the best practice and the practice wisdom that's out there. Research might have a lot to say or a little to say about whatever it is you're doing. But we want to know what we can draw on from the existing evidence and experience. So that's an explicit step. The second is that we want to create a plan for strong and scalable implementation of our solution. That's going to be the roadmap. We'll talk about that. And thirdly, we want to identify how do we measure the success of our solution? Because if we don't know how to measure our success, we probably won't know when we have arrived. And we want to make sure we know that. We also want to make sure what are those incremental success measures along the way, because it may be a while before we, quote, arrive. So the roadmap can help with that too. So here is the roadmap. At a high level, this is kind of what it looks like. And so you can see there are 4 elements to a roadmap. Now, one of the key differences that I want to point out right off the bat, especially for those of you who have experience doing logic models or theory of change, is that this whole approach is really meant to be more practice oriented, more behavior oriented. And if you think of your typical logic model, it uses language along the lines of inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, short, medium, and long term, right? It sounds like we're making widgets. And that exercise can be helpful, but here the roadmap centers our attention on behavior and practice change. And the focus is this red box here in the center of the roadmap. And that's one of the key differences between this approach and maybe prior experiences you've had doing this kind of work. The key here is that we want to tell a compelling story with our roadmap, right? Each of your teams is coming to the table with some sort of a vision about what you want to achieve, whether it's automation in North Carolina or modernization in North Dakota, or maybe it's whole family, full family engagement and service delivery in Washington State, or it's a new and improved 21st century internship program in Larimer County. Whatever it is that you are coming to design and develop, that's your blue box here. That's the solution. What are the components? How does this thing work that you want to develop and have succeed in your program? But in order for that blue box to be successful, in order for this solution that you've devised in your minds, that you've created a vision around, and that you want to use the next 12 months to really make happen, we're going to need an explicit strategy around how we get your system, your organization, and your people to change their mindsets, behaviors, and skill sets so that that thing actually succeeds. Most logic models and theory of change do not get to that level of granularity in terms of unpacking how do we actually help people change. Because even though some of the work that you all are doing is systems change, right? It's complicated, complex, large scale transformation. When that gets down to the ground level, it is about people and how people behave. And so unless we have an explicit strategy to help people change their behavior, then we're not maximizing our chances of success. And the roadmap is a tool to help us think in terms of people, in terms of humans. How do humans change? And what are the strategies that we're going to use to help humans change? So that's the red box. The only way to develop the red box, which is the change strategies, is to think really hard and to talk with a wide variety and a diverse group of people to understand what about our environment, what factors are going to help and hinder the blue box, the solution, right? So if you want to do A, you need to know what's going to help us do A and what's going to hinder us doing A. And then you need a whole nother set of strategies, which is B, of here's how we help people change so that A actually works. And that leads you over to the right-hand side, which is the outcomes, the green box. What does success look like? And if you walk through that exercise with your team and with your stakeholders and you map it all out, then what you should have created is a story, a compelling argument for why this makes sense, a narrative. So a roadmap is an excellent check on whether you have narrative alignment. You should be able to walk in and talk to any participant in your program and tell a compelling story for why here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to help people change because these are the factors that are going to get in our way. And that's going to lead us to this measurable success. If that's not a compelling argument, then it's time to redo your roadmap. And if you're not there yet, that's okay. This is an exercise of building it collaboratively with your team and with your stakeholders. So think of it a little bit like a change management tool and not just an exercise. As I mentioned, this is not just a form that I want you to fill out at some point with your coaching team. And so I think one of the best metaphors to use here is Waze, right? Waze is helpful because it gives you accurate and specific information about the route that you're going to take to get to your destination. You plug in an address, here's where I want to go. Waze is going to let you know, here's about when you're going to get there, and here's the route that we're going to use to take you there. And along that route, it's going to give you timely information about the factors that are going to help or hinder your success along the way, right? And in fact, you're going to get some, potentially you're going to get some real-time updates that you weren't expecting. Oh, there's a wreck on the I-5. Oh, there's a speed trap up ahead. What's not helpful is if Waze only told you obstacle ahead, warning. Well, you don't know what the obstacle is, right? Is it traffic? And if all Waze told you is it's traffic up ahead, well, if you don't know where the traffic is, then how are you going to work around it? What's your strategy to address the traffic if you don't know specifically where it is and how long the backup is? If you don't know where the speed trap is, then you don't know when to slow down, assuming you're speeding. So Waze is helpful because in real time, it is giving you this plan, but it's also thinking about here are the factors that could affect your plan, and we're going to adapt and revise that plan accordingly based on the specific information that we're getting. I want you to think of your roadmap kind of like Waze, so that it becomes this active tool for managing. In the same way, you're using the roadmap to put in a destination and define in concrete ways, here's where we want to arrive. And then here's the route that we're going to take to get there. That's your solution. The streets and the turns that you're going to make. But along the way, we can anticipate that there are going to be things that help us and hinder us. And so the more specific we can be about that, the better we can plan for how to address and work around those factors. The less effort we put in on the front end to identify those factors, the more work we have to do on the back end when we're, to continue with the analogy, sitting in traffic. So we want to be proactive. We want to start to bring up and surface some of those potential factors right out of the gate. And that's where your stakeholders can be really helpful. We don't want to just sit in headquarters and think about these things. We want to go talk to participants. We want to go talk to line staff. We want to talk to community partners, have them help us understand what's going to get in the way and what's going to help, because then we can plan. All right, so let's talk about the components of the roadmap in a little bit more depth. Here I want to talk about what's the what. The what is your solution. It's what you want people, since we're in human services, it's mostly people, maybe sometimes it's a computer, but mostly it's people. What do we want people to do differently that might generate a better outcome? Each of you came into the TANF learning community with a vision for that. You wrote a proposal. And maybe that's been revised, maybe it's been refined, maybe you're still fully committed to that idea, right? So we want to take that vision and we want to break it down and we want to specify what is it and who needs to change, like who's involved in that actually happening. How will we do it? And what are the steps to actually accomplish this change? To use the Larimer example, if you guys want to build a whole new internship model, right, then you need to define what are the components of that internship model. Is it just within DHS? Does it involve community partners? Who needs to change? Well, that depends on what it is, right? We think about what is happening and who is involved in making it happen. And we define the steps for accomplishing it. What is the process? All of this, I like to call the core components. That's defining what it is. And to do this, one way to think about it is to consider the P's. And this is just an easy way to remember it. Is sort of to think through, all right, if we're going to define what it is we're going to do differently, then we might need to think about what are the principles? Like what are the underlying values, assumptions, principles that we're committed to that are going to make a difference here, right? If you're talking about whole family or full family services, then there probably are some core principles that are really fundamental, some values that are going to drive the way that you approach designing services in a whole family centric way. So principles are important because that undergirds what it is. You also need to think about, as I mentioned before, what do people need to do? And how is that any different from what they're currently doing? Because if there's not a lot of daylight there, right, then maybe we need to revisit how different or distinct is this from the status quo? How much are we pushing beyond the status quo to really change practice and service delivery? So the second P is about people. What do people need to do differently? What skills might they need? What behaviors do they need to perform? What do people need to do? The third P, which is kind of two because they're similar, are processes and policies, right? We can't just think about people. We also have to think about the structure, the ecosystem in which they sit. How do the processes around people and the policies that drive people, how do those things need to change? That's all part of defining your what. And then fourth, the fourth P is products. Now that might feel a little odd in our context, but I couldn't think of another P word. So products is about what are the resources, what are the tools that we're going to need to do this, right? Maybe what you're trying to do is implement a new coaching model. And so you might need some tools to use with participants in the coaching model. Maybe you're developing a new online application and assessment. You're going to need a tool, a product to make that happen. So the P's is just a nice way to break it down and think about how we define our solution, or what is it? Principles, people, processes and policies, and products. And yes, Sorna, to your point, products are not the end result in this context. Products are something that you use to achieve the end result. A tool, a resource, whatever that goes into delivering what it is that you want to do. And so this is often where a logic model stops. A logic model talks about what are the inputs and the activities. But then we need to go that additional step of how do we bring about this what? We just defined this thing. We got our P's, our principles, and our people, and our processes and policy changes, and our products that we're going to use. So let's go do it. Well, the only way to go and do it successfully is to know how we're going to get people to do those P's. How do we bring about the P's? And so there, we want to spend some time thinking about and connecting with the work that we've done under the learn phase, which is identifying influencers. What's going to help our change and what's going to get in the way of our change. So a really clear connection here between the learn phase and the innovate phase. So let me make that a little more practical, bring it down to the ground level. A way to think about that is to consider, all right, I've got this new thing that I want people to do. So what capabilities, knowledge and skills are needed for that change? To go with the coaching example, if I want people to use a coaching approach to working with participants in my program, like let's honestly assess whether the staff that we have possess the knowledge and skills needed to execute on that model. Do we need to train them? Do they need coaching and support to be an effective coach for participants? What knowledge and skills, what capabilities are required? How are we going to build that? What's our plan to build capabilities so that people can actually do this? Second, zoom out a layer and think about what are the opportunities? What's going on around the person that might affect them doing this, right? We could, again, to continue with the coaching analogy, we might say, all right, we're using a coaching approach in our TANF program moving forward. It's all about your goals. It's all about your motivation. We're jazzed. But every Monday morning, that case manager gets a work participation report, and they know that the primary thing that matters to their supervisor and to the program is that they are hitting very specific targets every single week around hours reported, right? Perhaps a necessary evil or a necessary part of the program, but if that's what's going on around the individual, if the messaging continues to be, here's what you're accountable to, here's what I need you to focus on with your participants, gather the hours, gather the documentation, gather the hours, and we're not changing that messaging or figuring out how to message that the program focus is also on these things, then that individual might not change their behavior, right? So the environment, the opportunities to actually change behavior is important to think about here too. And then lastly, it's motivation. As you think about what might help or hinder your change, it's what beliefs, mindsets are present in our environment right now that are going to get in the way or that we can build on. People got into this work because they wanted to help people. That's something we can build on. When we're asking them to change and use a whole new technology, what is it that's going to get in the way there? Are people kind of resistant to new technology? Have they had bad experiences with technology? what is the sort of general mindset or belief among staff or among our stakeholders that we might need to think about? And the last thing I'll say here is that it's important to note that for each of these different categories, you need a different strategy to address it, right? For capabilities, training, coaching, mentoring, professional development is probably the right set of strategies to use. But for opportunities, I don't know that training is going to do anything. So we can throw training all day long at it, but training's not going to change the environment or the structure. So that might be, we need to revise policy. We need to simplify the process. We need to change messaging and communication to staff or to our partners. Motivation, similarly, training people on their mindset may not be the best strategy. That might be, we need to think differently about communication. Maybe we need to find ways to improve staff morale. Maybe we need to think about creating some sort of a work group that is going to create staff buy-in so that people feel bought into the change that we're making. So I just want to highlight that as we think about what's going to get in our way and what's going to help us, the solution to each of those factors is going to be unique. It's not always going to be training, which is a go-to. It might be a variety of different strategies. And so having gone through that exercise of thinking about capabilities and opportunities and motivation, then you can come back to, all right, so what about that factor? What needs to change? Who needs to change? When does it need to change? Where does it need to change? How often or with whom does it need to change? And if you start to answer those questions, then you can develop a very specific strategy for how you're going to help make that change happen. And that is different than simply defining what your internship program looks like, or what your whole family service approach looks like, or what your modernized TANF program includes, right? Does that make sense? This is sort of the key to getting into the black box of implementation so that we don't end up designing a great idea that falls flat when it rolls out with staff. Thinking about how we bring about the change is thinking about how do we actually get people to be a part of the change process with us, and let's have a plan specifically for how we help them do that. Change strategies. And then that brings you to thinking about what are our measures for success? How will we know that our what worked? How will our program be any different? How will participants' experiences be any different as a result of what we have just said we're going to do? And I think it's important for this group especially to think about what are some short-term accomplishments. We shouldn't wait until December, which is the end of this TANF learning community, to take a look at whether or not we're making progress. We should be thinking about what are those benchmarks 3 months from now, 6 months from now, 9 months from now, all the way up to December. If we're accountable to those short-term accomplishments as a team, we're much more likely to make progress. And then kind of having that goal of where we want to be by December when this TANF learning community comes to a close is important, but your initiative may not fit totally within that. And so I think you also need to name what are those ultimate outcomes. Those could take a year, they could take 5 years to realize. All 3 of those matter, and they belong on your roadmap to define what success looks like. For now, I want to encourage teams to think about not did it work, but how do we get it to work better? Because as you start to design your roadmap and roll some of this out, the question should not be, does it work? Because you're not there yet. You think about how a car manufacturer builds a car, they take specific parts of that car. They got a whole team dedicated to getting those leather seats right. That team is not asking the question, does the car work? They're trying to ask, how do we get these leather seats to be as comfortable as they can possibly be? They're trying to improve it, trying to make it better, better, better. And then when you bring the whole car together, when you bring the whole initiative together, then you can start to ask the question, does it work? And sometimes we flip it, right? We roll out a pilot and we start asking, does it work? when in fact we should start with the question, how do we make it work better? Because we are improving this early draft version, and then we get to, does it work? But regardless of where you are in the process, we want to be asking ourselves, how do we get it to work better for whom and under what circumstances? Because you want to know, are there differences or disparities based on race or gender or where people live? Because if you can understand their experiences and how it doesn't seem to be working or is working really well for them, that also helps you make it better for people for whom it is not working well. All right. So before we turn to the panel, I wanted to show you an example of a roadmap. And I know this is a lot on screen. I'm not going to go in depth through this. I simply want to call out one thing, and then you can take some time to look at the example in the slides that were provided, as well as we also attached another example in PDF to the meeting invite. But the thing I love about this roadmap, which was actually developed by a care coordination initiative in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, shout out to my North Carolina friends, is take a look at this middle column where they have their integration strategy or their change strategies mapped out. Every single one of those strategies, some of which is training, some of it is storytelling, some of it is celebrating wins, some of it's mentoring, right? Some of it's talking about long-term plans for the programs. Every one of those has a number in parentheses after it. And that's because this team mapped every single change strategy to one of those influencing factors down at the bottom of the screen. And what I love about that is it's all connected, right? They thought through over on the left-hand side, here's what our intervention is. This MEC success program, here's what it is, the core principles, here's what people do and how they do it at a high level, of course. And then here are the core tools that we use. And they thought about, here are the factors. These are things that are going to help, and these are things that are going to hinder. Number 6, one thing that is going to hinder them is the mindset, it won't last. They knew that would be a problem. Staff will say, this thing isn't going to last. This is another, idea that somebody's rolling in with, and we'll do it for 18 months and then we'll move on. So they knew that would be a challenge. And so they came up with a specific set of strategies to combat that. We're going to talk about our long-term plans for scaling this initiative in the county. We're going to engage our community partners in helping us scale it. We're going to develop new partnerships solely for expanding MEC success. And we're going to share data about the program with our partners so that everybody's holding us accountable to keep this thing going. I mean, that is a meaningful and responsive strategy to a specific thing that they saw on their roadmap as getting in the way. And I love that because it created a plan for them to address the challenge when it arose proactively. All right, so enough of me. I want to invite Aaron and Gerard to join me on camera if you can. And so both Aaron and Gerard have been through this process at different times. And so I just wanted them to have a chance to share a little bit and for you guys to ask questions. So I haven't seen a whole lot of questions in the chat, but I want to get you thinking right now. What questions are coming up for you? And please feel free to pose those in the chat, queue them up, and we'll turn to them in a couple minutes. Or when we get to the questions, feel free to unmute and ask a question directly. So to get things started, it doesn't matter to me which of you goes first, so I'll let you fight over it. But for Aaron and Gerard, could you maybe start off just a little bit of telling us, some context about your program, really brief, the types of services that you provide, kind of how your program is organized and how many families you serve, and then the reason that you sort of made a change to your program.
All right, I will go first. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gerard Johnson. I'm the Director of Programs for our Michigan Work Services here in the Great Lakes Bay region. The Great Lakes Bay region makes up 5 counties here in mid-Michigan. We are one of 16 Michigan Works agencies in the state of Michigan. And mentioned the Great Lakes Bay represents 5 counties. Our mission is to, assist employers in finding and retaining qualified employees and ensure that the labor force meets the needs of employers. We serve TANF SNAP populations, WEO, adult dislocated worker and youth. Our trade programs, employment services, Wagner Pizer, working with the general public. We provide job training, job search services, work experience, talent tours, workshops, including job search, resume writing, communication, those regular employability skills, ex-offenders, customer service, interviewing, social networking, social media, job skills assessment, and supportive services. We wanted to make a change. We saw a need for change. We were introduced to the career coaching model at our annual Michigan Works conference a couple years ago. And what stood out to me about the approach was that the career, the goal-centered approach for career coaching was more focused on setting goals for participants and less on WPR. It was interesting, and WPR meaning for the TANF community should know, but the work participation rate. It is interesting to hear in the workshop that we were in, that even though a 60 and 70% WPR is a great accomplishment and something that we were meeting those performance goals of a 60, 70% WPR each month, but there was no correlation between a high WPR and an increase in self-sufficiency. So we were interested in learning a little bit more about that. And that was the reason for deciding to make this change, to see if there were other things out there, this career coaching model that would help our participants and lead them to self-sufficiency, opposed to focusing on just the numbers and the WPR. So that is one of the reasons why we decided to make the change that we did.
Awesome. Thanks, Gerard.
Mm-hmm.
Erin.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Erin Olikin, and I'm the director of the Reach Up program, which is Vermont's TANF program. And we also administer our post-secondary education program and Reach Ahead, which is a transitional program, and people leave Reach Up to provide transitional supports as they're going to work. We serve about 2,300 families throughout the state with parents and caregivers who are participating in the programs. And when I became the director of the program in 2016, it was something that we had just kind of started, I would say, within the last few years to transition into a strength-based approach, but we really hadn't made any kind of changes in terms of how we worked with participants. And so it was really interesting because there was kind of this juxtaposition between saying, we have a strength-based approach and we look at the whole family, which we really did, but at the same time having these kind of work requirements and really strong rule-based, compliance-based program on the other side. And so trying to fit those pieces together, really realizing that these don't fit together really well. And as Gerard mentioned, really seeing that work participation rate isn't necessarily an indication of how well people are doing and whether they're better off in the future and whether they're, obtaining sustainable employment and economic stability for their families and other factors of well-being for their kids and their entire family. And so, I really started learning more, and our team started learning more about what it means to be a trauma responsive organization, about brain science, concepts of scarcity. And that really just kind of solidified for me that our program needed to move further away from the kind of TANF model of TANF, I guess, work participation rates being such a kind of front and center piece of the program, and to move into a model that really would grow alongside families and listen to what they are telling us that they need in order to succeed and what success means for them. And so in Vermont, the roadmap started with a huge mission and vision process. And that was a really, really important step, I think, for us in our process, because our program didn't have a mission. We had kind of the statutory language around what the purpose of our program was. But we wanted to kind of get at what are the things that we all value as a community of providers and of families who are participating in this program, and use that to drive how we moved forward with our roadmap. And so that's really kind of, I guess, our journey, our history of kind of how we went about starting to make the change and then move forward with that.
Awesome. So a couple of things. One, no federal laws were harmed in the making of these roadmaps, I promise. And second, the thing that stuck out to me was both of you mentioned work participation requirements, which my colleagues on the call here, the TANF learning community, this has come up multiple times for many of the teams. So, right, a very common issue. But neither Vermont nor Michigan Works Great Lakes Bay made any changes to the work participation rate or requirements. And so I think that's important, because it's not like we waved a magic wand and somehow got some sort of a special license to say, well, let's set that to the side. We had to, your teams had to develop roadmaps in the context of those requirements staying the same. So I'd like for you to say a little bit about, like, what did that roadmap development process look like for your teams? What was helpful? What was hard? What was challenging about the process of working through that as a team?
It was exciting because there's different, thoughts about change, and we saw that at the very beginning. Some people were saying change is painful, some were excited. So you have all that as you're working towards this roadmap for change, knowing that, especially in the TANF side of things, changing the way our staff's thinking about WPR. We were in a unique situation because at the time that we kind of started everything, our WPR was kind of lower anyway due to COVID and the relaxed participation requirements that were put on by the state. So that was something that we were able to kind of set aside a little bit anyway, but it was still very difficult. But the process was exciting because there was change coming. It was exciting to see the change, how it was going to develop. So developing this roadmap, you're creating this plan, and you're seeing your outcomes and what those outcomes are going to be. And you're creating this idea of, what you want to do and where you want to go, and creating your plan of how you're going to get there. It was helpful to have this drawn out process of what needed to be done. So everyone is all on the same page. We all know what our goals are. We all know what we need to do to move forward. It was helpful to see how our efforts were going to pay off. Something that we did was not only incorporate this coaching model within the TANF programs, but we incorporated across all of our programs in our agency, as well as try to change the culture of our agency and using this model with supervisors and meeting with staff and creating and building relationships and better relationships with our staff, and encouraging them and empowering them to increase their potential and their professional potential, as well as in their personal lives. So this was something that we incorporated across our entire agency. So that was something that was unique. So that was also challenging. Another helpful thing was to see the potholes, the things that were going to get in our way, and creating those detours and that could be developed. So, you had mentioned those kind of the things before, Jonathan. We've done this before. This is just something that's going to happen, and then it's going to fall by the wayside. This is something that just one of those other trainings that we're going to go to, and then it's going to be going back to the same old. But so that was a challenge to make sure that we moved forward and continued with this process so it didn't fall by the wayside. Initially, the change was again supposed to be just for the program, so it was agency wide, so that was a challenge. And just getting everyone to understand the reason, the why we were making this change, the reasons behind everything, and we were empowering our participants to set their own goals so they can take ownership of their success. It's no longer us telling them what they're going to do, or no longer us telling them, creating a plan for them. It was, the ball's in their court now. You're telling us what you need, and now we're coaching you to help you get to where you need to go.
And if I can just add one thing and brag about Gerard's team, he's talked about this coaching, career coaching model. That's all oriented around the participants and serving the participants. But your team's primary change strategy, how you get people to change, was a different way of doing leadership and supervision within the program, right? And so I love that you started with this vision to change practice at the front lines. And in order to get there, your primary change strategy was, oh, managers and supervisors have to change what they're doing. We have to supervise staff in a different way so that staff then do their work in a different way. And that was, that's not an easy shift. So I just wanted to call that out because I think that's really important. And the roadmap kind of clarified that that was a key way of getting to the outcomes that you want to see.
So in Vermont, I would say, very similar to what Gerard was saying, that it was really inspiring and energizing to work on this, to have these conversations. It really kind of helped remind us of why we do this work. And also, this process helps us to remember to be humble and reevaluate things that in the past we thought maybe we're good, and at any given point, I think as program administrators and what we're doing, we do the best we can at any given moment with the information that we have and kind of the resources that we have, and then realizing that we know a better way forward now. And so this process kind of helped us to have a lot of those conversations and think about and evaluate what are the priorities that we need to set for the program moving forward, and kind of what needs to change. I would say in terms of what was challenging, everyone has really limited bandwidth, and just kind of trying to do this, it's in some ways kind of labor intensive because it's not a top-down approach. It isn't something where you just kind of say like, here, this is what we're going to do next. It's about involving a lot of people in the process, and it's completely worth it. And I think in the long run, it does save time, and it saves, it helps with the buy-in, and it's really, in my opinion, it's the right way to go, to really involve all your stakeholders in that process and the planning. But sometimes I think this type of planning, because it is something that requires so many different people to participate in it, it can take some convincing that it isn't just kind of fluff. Like this really is important and integral to doing this work, and to create the best program possible. We need as much buy-in and as many different kind of perspectives from people who are involved in some capacity as possible. Oh, and the other challenge is data for us. That's a big one. We're a very small state, and I think sometimes for small states in particular, data systems are a big challenge, and that is certainly true in Vermont, trying to get the data that we need to kind of evaluate and reevaluate.
Great, thank you, Erin. Yeah, that stakeholder piece is huge. It is, it's not necessarily the most efficient and fast process. but there's a lot of value in getting a lot of people at the table and having them work through and provide a diverse array of perspectives on this new approach. All right, I don't see any questions in the chat, but I want to provide just a little bit of space here in case anybody would like to ask. So do we have any? Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, you know by now, I cannot end this session without saying something. Right?
I love it.
One, let me say, I do not feel recycled again today. So y'all are on a roll.
All right.
Two,
that's an accomplishment.
I would say, I've been listening to this whole process, and I would like to thank all of you because you are anything that created doubt in my mind. You eventually said something like, okay, you got it. Okay, you got it. The buying motivators, the changing the mindsets, the cognitive behavior, which you really didn't say. I heard Aaron mention values. I'm like, okay, great, you got it. I'm listening to your P's, Jonathan, and this is my question, and this is for Jared, Aaron, and anybody else out there. If you were to interject another P, meaning patience, how much patience is necessary? You mentioned data. How long should you look at the short term and the long term before you now have critical data to show the pendulum is moving? Help me, Dr. Nicole. Come with me now. I know. So thank you for letting me ask my question. I'm going to be quiet and listen to your response.
So good.
I'll speak on the additional P, the patience. This was a process that we've started a couple years ago, and we're still, in the process of innovating and improving. It's constant. We're always learning something else, trying to, find innovative ways and improve what we're doing. So you have to be patient. This isn't anything that's going to happen overnight, especially the amount of change that we were trying to incorporate. So you have to understand and be patient to know that when you're trying to change the mindsets of not only the staff that we're working with, but our participants in our our TANF, it's called PATH, our PATH program, individuals who have been, you see the same participants, sometimes over and over and over again. So they are familiar with the way your program works, and they know they're going to come in, they're going to do an orientation, they're going to get this and this, they're going to have to submit these hours, they're going to have job search, do community service, I can go train. They're waiting for us to tell them what to do. And now we're putting the ball in their court and saying, no, you tell us what you need and we're going to support you in that. So it's something that takes a while. So you do have to have patience because it's not anything that's going to happen overnight. This is still a process that we're continuing to learn. And like I said, this has been going since the pandemic started. So we, that's where we're at, and we're not fully implemented yet. So it's been a while. It's constant learning and figuring out what's working and going back to the drawing board and trying to find things that are going to continue to improve what we're doing.
Thanks, Gerard. Aaron, I know you want to speak to the 5th P.
I sure do. What a great question. I actually see two sides to this. One I see as absolutely culture change does take time. And I've been reminded, boy, did I get a kick in the last 8 or 10 weeks, I would say, in realizing in that lesson, in realizing, yes, this takes time. It's a process, and understanding that people are at so many different areas on that continuum. And some people are those early adopters, and are just like, yeah, let's go. And then you've got the people who are kind of in the middle, swayed, and then the people who are just like, no way, never. And having the patience to kind of think about where you want to focus your energy too, and not getting too hung up in the people who say absolutely no way. And that's where my patience kind of ends. And I'm like, if you don't like it, then it's not the right program for you. If you're going to dig your heels in that much, it's time to move on. And I can't really say that, but but that's essentially, it's kind of like you need to jump on board, guys, because this is the way that we're moving. And my other piece around patience is kind of like, I love big change. I think we need so many massive policy changes in laws, and I understand that it can't happen overnight, but I also think being too patient is not always good either, because sometimes it's like, no, that needs to change, you know, and I'm tired. Like, I don't want to be patient about that. It's time to change. So, and so I think there's a balance between the two of kind of at some point saying, no, we're not going, this is something that needs to change. But also understanding that, you know, bringing people along in that process it can be a long journey, and being patient with people's kind of figuring things out and things like that. And then the piece about data, so I have this kind of, I might get a little warm and fuzzy here for a second, so forgive me, but I kind of have, you know, I read this thing once that was written by the Harvard Center and the Developing Child, and they were talking about evidence-based programs and what works. And, you know, we have so much data on what does work. But we also kind of have this obsession with data sometimes where it's like, show me that it works. And sometimes it's like, maybe it's just the right thing to do. And can we get behind that? Because this is something, you know, whatever it happens to be. In our case, we're really working on a coaching model right now. And it's because it's the right thing to do. It empowers participants. It is respectful of families' journeys and where they really are and what they want with their lives. And yes, we want the data, and I do believe the data shows that it is more beneficial as well. But I also don't want to lose sight, and that ties back into the values piece of what do we value as a program and as professionals and as participants or families, is that I think it's okay to hang on to that piece too, of like, where's just the right way to go.
This is good. So I know I'm encroaching on our breakout time just a little bit, but I do not want to miss a question in the chat, which I think would be really helpful. So Aaron and Gerard, if you can give like a speed answer to this question. Did you all do a pilot in a few counties, areas, regions prior to implementing the changes kind of broader scale?
I would say our pilot was kind of our road test that we did with, we started off doing a road test with our staff. So managers were meeting with staff, making sure that they understood and understanding the process of goal for it and understanding. So again, so when they would have an understanding that they would have an, you know, be able to go through the process and understanding with their participants on their caseload. And then from there, we did kind of do a small little pilot where each career coach started working the model with, you know, we asked them to work with 5 individuals on their caseload. And we had a survey after, you know, they had to submit a survey after each meeting that they had, so we could learn what they were getting out and, you know, how it was working for them and things like that. So our pilot kind of was the road test that we did. It was, you know, with a small group of participants to start to find out where, you know, what our staff understood from the meetings that they were having with leadership, and find out how the participants were responding to the change in their meetings with their career coaches. And, you know, we had surveys and asked them, you know, certain questions. So that was kind of our pilot.
Yeah, and we also had a pilot in a few different, our state is broken up for TANF into 12 different districts. And so we had a few districts do a road test of what was kind of our revamp that went along with our mission and vision work, our revamp of our assessment process. And so we use now the stepping stones process, and that kind of jump starts that conversation around goals and meaningful goals. And what does that look like? What are your priorities as a family? And so we did that in several districts, and then had the kind of cycle of revising it and trying it again, and got feedback from participants on how they felt about it, and how staff felt about it, and made revisions based on that before we unrolled that assessment statewide.
And I'll just make one final point on that, because I think it's a really clear distinction from how pilots can go where we're trying to prove something, right? In Vermont, let's just say not everybody was happy about the new assessment. And so as a part of this sort of road testing, we had the opportunity to hear from staff what's working well and what's not working well. Where do you need more support? Why is this not working well for you and for your participants? Give us constructive feedback so that we can think about how do we better support you in using this. And so the road test actually helped us create additional learning opportunities and improvement opportunities, rather than just trying to, all right, we need to justify to the assistant secretary that this assessment thing can work. It was actually an opportunity to use staff feedback across the state and in some initial communities to begin with, to refine it and to make the process better for staff and for participants. I think that's the value here, that the roadmap provides a foundation for thinking about what it should look like, and then you revise it based on what you learn. Okay, well, I know we are over our time allotment here. And I want to get you guys into some breakout rooms so that you can talk with your teams and kind of debrief what you've heard. So Aaron and Gerard, feel free to stick around if you can until the end of our session when folks come back, in case there are more questions, but you can also feel free to head out. But over the next, let's say 20 or so minutes, since we're a little behind schedule, you're going to go into a breakout room with your state or tribal or county team and your coach and liaison, and just take a few minutes to kind of react. What's coming up for you right now? Maybe you want to think about how clear is our what, right? How many of those P's do you feel like you have a clear sense on right now? If it's 0, that's okay. If it's 4, great. If it's 5, you're ahead of all of us. What are the steps that you could take to crystallize, like better define what it is you want to do differently, and start the process of designing some of those change strategies? And I think very importantly, who might you partner with? So take some time in your breakouts to chat about 1 or 2 or 3 of these questions, and then we will come back together in about 20 minutes for any final questions or comments. Casey Gray, any instructions for the group?
Thanks, John. I will be opening them up, and it will be self-selection this time, just like our last session. So if you're in full Zoom screen mode, you should see either a breakout button option on the bottom of your screen, or an option to select 3 little gray dots that will pop up another menu for breakout. If you can't find that button, no worries, just either chat me or speak up and I'll manually assign you. So I'll go ahead and open these up.
All right, we have everybody back. Hopefully you guys got a chance to chat a little bit and debrief. So I know we don't have a lot of time before we wrap up here, but I wanted to provide just a little bit of space for any outstanding questions. And while I give some space for that, I would love for you to just put some things in the chat that bubbled up in your breakouts. So maybe some question, a key question that emerged, maybe an insight or a reflection. Please feel free to post those things in the chat now. All right, so Sorna, great question. Are there any resources for measuring subjective shifts? That is such a big part of implementation and assessing how implementation is going, right? That there's like some change that you expect to see in mindset, right? How do I measure that? How do I quantify that? What kind of data can I look at? You know, part of that work, I think, has to be your team really digging into what, if it's a mindset or if it's a behavior, trying to define that as best you can. And sometimes like there may be some measures out there or some ways to evaluate, maybe through an observation or some other sort of tool that your coach could connect you to that we could look into for you. But I would say by and large, a lot of this has to do with really thinking about your team coming together and defining what is that subjective shift that we're looking for. You know, if we're talking about a culture shift in the way that we think about how our program operates, or if I want the tone of case managers working with participants to be different, what does that look like for us? And if you can define that in, you know, in your own ways, it also then provides you a tool for staff maybe to self-assess. You know, am I using this language? Am I following these steps in the process? Or maybe it's an observation tool that peers can use with one another to come in and take, I'm going to observe you working with a participant, and I'm going to use kind of this behavior checklist to see like which of these things am I seeing present and which am I not. So that's a really complicated issue that your coaching team, I know, would love to dig in with you on, and that we can find some resources to support you, but that your team can also play a pivotal role in defining. All right, let's see. There's a question here around any political pushback for changing from WPR focus to human-centered design. How did you overcome it? So unfortunately, both Aaron and Gerard had to step out. But you know, I'm happy to put that question to them and share back the insights, because better than I can explain it, I think they can speak exactly to what that looked like on the ground in Vermont and Great Lakes Bay. So I will make a note of that and we'll try to share back. But I will say that nothing about the work participation requirements changed. You know, it's not, as I said, Vermont didn't get any sort of a waiver. Great Lakes Bay wasn't able to, okay, we're going to take our requirements from here down to here. None of that happened. It was all, how do we meet the same requirements in a different way? And I think what they had to do was to really question their assumptions about, this is the way to do it. The only way to do it is through assigning activities, collecting these job logs, and providing these sorts of incentives or consequences if people do or don't do it, right? Because there's sort of a typical way that that's done. And so I think they stepped back from some of those common approaches and said, how do we get to the same result, which is people actively participating in the program and in the offerings that we have, but going about it in a different way. So Casey Gray just put in the chat an evaluation. We would love for you to fill that out. In all seriousness, this will help me and the rest of the team get better, right? We're trying to get better, not necessarily just does it work or does it not, but how do we improve? So please fill that out and share your honest feedback about what works well and what doesn't, so that we can keep doing the things that are good and stop doing the things that are bad. I also hope that today's session is not just 90 minutes out of your Tuesday, but that it directly connects into your next coaching session. So thinking about what's next for your team, I hope you had some time to digest that, and then you can bring it up in your next coaching session with your coach. Don't let this just be, you know, a presentation. Let it be a catalyst for the beginning of your roadmap journey. We are here to support you, and I'm really excited to see what you guys do. So Lisa, would you like to say any closing words before we adjourn?
Hi, John. No, I don't have any additional words. Thank you so much for your presentation, and I hope this was useful to everyone on the line. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Take good care.
Thank you.